Welcome back to the Show My Scars podcast. I'm your host, Derek Duker. Something that I imagine most parents do, is constantly worry that I'm failing to break a cycle of emotional trauma with my kid, or simply that I'm passing on my unhealthy mental habits. This led me to reach out to my daughter's therapist, Charlten Henderson. Even if you don't have children or you don't even plan to have kids, I think a lot of what we discussed can be applied to adult relationships as well. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Charlten Henderson. I want to say how much I appreciate you coming on to talk during the podcast. For the listeners out there, you actually do counsel my daughter, and I never thought about it until the other day, but something that comes up in my life repeatedly that I think other parents struggle with is wondering, like, are we doing it right? I think that's a huge part of being a parent, which obviously you have kids as well, and you just had one recently. So first off, why don't you talk a little bit about, your position with Burl and kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis for them.
Absolutely. So I'm Charlten Henderson, and I serve as a school-based clinician for Burl. So that's just been a therapist inside of the school, making sure that we're able to meet, every need that is being present. So we do a variety of counseling skills with kids and just trying to make sure that they are, mentally ready to go about each day.
Yeah, which I think it's so cool because, I'm 32 now, and I remember back when I was going to elementary school, we did not have anything like that, and how much that would have helped me in my life to understand better what was going on in my own mind. Because I think back then, like, I don't even know what I would attribute, my mental health problems to.
Absolutely.
So, like, there was nothing to point to, but once you do identify those things, it becomes so much easier to deal with.
Yes.
What's the process? Like, how do you talk to the kids about mental health? Like, how do you get them to understand those concepts?
One of the things I try to do is just normalize conversations, not put a label on someone right away, because I know what labels people typically research, or they run with that label and they cannot see themselves outside of that thing that they've been identified as. I like to simplify it and break it down that we are meant to connect with people, and I try to connect, just build some type of rapport with them, a relationship, and then I figure out how I can be an asset to them or an asset to their day and help them problem solve. But I've never approached the situation where I'm like, hey, seems that you're dealing with ADHD. Tell me more about that. And then they get fixated on that label, and they will attribute a lot of their problems to that label and or act as if they are only that label. So for me, I just try to normalize conversations and just treat them as the person that they are, and make sure that they know that they are seen.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I heard something the other day that I had never thought about, because we talk about how nice it is that, it is destigmatized now. But they were talking about it from another angle that I'd never thought about, where there's all this information out there, and some people who may just be struggling with the day-to-day things of life may now, like you were talking about earlier, see that label, apply it to themselves, and now believe that they maybe have a disorder where maybe they just don't have the tools to think through their issues.
Absolutely. In many ways, it reminds me of the Stanford experiment. I want to say it was back in the 70s. If you ever look up that experiment where they talk about the effects of stereotype. And I'm not saying that labels are those things, but typically when someone is aware of a stereotype about themselves or their race, they typically, make sure that their stereotype comes true. So part of that Stanford experiment were like when Asian would come in and do a test, they would say, hey, do you know that statistically you're really good at math? Or when another race comes in, they will make sure that that race was aware of that stereotype, and they would typically perform to that stereotype. Again, I'm not comparing the two, but in my mind, I think about labels. When you have that label, it's a lot easier, to kind of fall in line with that. Like, oh, that makes sense, rather than just try and figure out who you are. We're all complex, and I don't think, just one size fit all.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think that's another way that I was kind of thinking about this issue because I've always struggled with, do I tell, my daughter what I'm struggling with?
Yes.
Because I know that it's very visible from the outside.
Yes.
I've had her, just look at me and be like, did you sleep well last night?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh man, she's seeing me deal with my anxiety right now, and it's draining me.
Absolutely.
And I don't know what to say to her because I don't want to, pass that on to her. Think like, oh, my dad has that, I must also have that.
Yeah.
So how would you approach that as a parent? Like, how do you talk about your own mental health struggles with your child?
Yeah. I think, just creating the space for that, making sure that, those conversations are transparent, because I'm a firm believer in whatever is in the ocean is eventually going to brush up on the shore. And that's kind of what your daughter is saying in terms of, if it's already in the ocean and it's coming up on shore, it's like you really can't hide that from her. So how can we have this conversation on a level that she understands that I'm not trying to hide these things, and I'm not trying to, in many ways, protect or control her destiny, but I want to make sure she's aware of how daddy is dealing with those and what resources I'm using to get, to combat some of these issues. And I know as parents, it's hard, because even as a professional, I have to remember, like, I can't protect them from everything. And I may not be protecting them from everything by not having certain conversations or not allowing them to experience things that I deem are, harmful or hurtful. So it's a very thin line, and I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way, but, acknowledging that it's challenging, but it's doable.
Yeah, I think that's important to remember. And yeah, there's, that old cliche, you can't hide things from your kids.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays, like.
Absolutely.
She can always tell when something's going on with me from, the time that we spend together. So, yeah, and I've tried that in the past of hiding things from her that I think are going to harm her, whether it's, a family member's health problems or, anything like that. What are the dangers of, hiding what's going on with us to our kids, from our kids?
Yeah, that can be very dangerous, because I try to simplify it by asking myself, is this something that I can truly control? Like that family member's, mental health issues, or, some problem that they've been, encountering for a while. If I can't control that, then I try not to control the narrative when I'm talking to that individual as well, because then you're constantly adding on to that story or trying to manipulate that story to fit your narrative. And sometimes we just deal with it as is. And as a parent, I think that's okay. Like, we don't always have to have the right answer, but that line of transparency, that line of respect is still there, and many times it's stronger because of that.
Right.
And it opens that true path of communication. Like, oh, daddy doesn't know it all, or mommy doesn't know it all.
No, I don't.
Like, we're okay with that. And I think as parents, it's hard to acknowledge that. Hey, I want to look like the perfect person in my kiddo's eyes. And being a counselor, I know now they're not looking for that.
No.
The most important thing, there's like, your daughter all the time, she's like, make sure he knows I love him. And it's like that moment right there can take away everything else that we were trying to control or manipulate. It's like, I felt that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just think keeping it simple. I'm a very simple person when it comes to problem solving.
Yeah. Well, it's easier that way. A lot less things to have to remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's so important, because it always goes back to the one thing I do remember from elementary school is I had a principal who would always come in every morning and remind us of the golden rule of treat others the way you want to be treated. He'd make us repeat that. And as a child, I thought it was so dumb, but the amount of times I've leaned on that advice as an adult even. And it applies to this situation, because how do you expect your child to communicate with you if you're not doing the same with them?
Absolutely, because our bodies and our emotions are typically always mirroring what's going on, so they pick up on that. Even my small children, when they're making facial expressions or, they have an outburst and they've said a word, I was like, where did they learn that? I was like, oh, when I was frustrated. They are creatures of habits, and they also see what's going on, and they, associate things easily, a lot easier than we do, because they're
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, that's how I deal with that thing. And after a while, that thing can compound, and we're like, okay, where did this happen? It happened a long time ago, but it's been building for so long that
hmm
we have to kind of break it back down and address it, to break those barriers down.
This episode is brought to you by Two Oddballs Creative. People on the internet can be a little bit judgy when it comes to websites, which, to be fair, is a good thing sometimes, especially when there's exchanging of money. However, that means your website design needs to be on point. Web development is much more than just how a site looks. It's also how it performs. A website needs to be quick, user-friendly, and direct consumers to performing your desired action. That's why I trusted Two Oddballs with my website and my logo. To get a hold of the Oddballs, just go to twooddballs.com, or you can call them at 417-986-6332. Whenever you are opening that line of communication, and maybe they do come up to you, like, I guess I can bring up a conversation I had with Annabella, but, she comes up to me and, during this time in my life, I'm not really dating. I'm, just kind of, working through things on that side of the fence. And
Absolutely.
she comes up to me and asks me, why I haven't remarried yet. And I was stuck at a loss of words, because there was all the, the bad thoughts I have about the dating scene. And, but there's also the good side of, what I'm doing to prepare myself to enter in there. But maybe for somebody who isn't as self-aware and isn't able to separate, like, okay, these are emotions I'm having, as opposed to here are the facts that I could share with them. How do you talk about things like that without imprinting those issues maybe onto the child?
Absolutely. That's a hard conversation for a lot of people. And I think just having the right people around to help you assess, some of those blind spots, and figuring out how can we have an educated conversation, that's informal, and helping them, come up with their own ideas about, dating. Because I think in that moment, she's also looking to you to see if you're going to come off with the right answer or your answer. And I think that's important in those moments to kind of differentiate between the two, because the right answer isn't always what's needed in that moment. And again, it doesn't make her love you any less. I just think, for us, it's assessing and figuring out where our blind spots are, and then, we can have those type of conversations. But there's no one way to just have that, I think.
Yeah, right. And then how would you talk to a child? Like, I think back to when I was growing up, and like I'm out on my grandfather's farm, and I'm working on things, and we're talking about what we want to be as a kid, and I remember, or as an adult, and I remember thinking like, the sky's the limit.
Yes.
At times, but in other times, I'm thinking like, maybe I don't have the ability to learn every little thing, required for that profession. But right now, I've been trying to figure out how to teach her that the best things in life are the hardest to achieve sometimes, like whether it be, your own mental health, or if there's something that you really want out there and you continue to experience hurdles that are in your way, you know, we there's all those sayings out there, you know, that you don't lose, you learn, or whatever like that. But those simple adages, at least for me as a kid,
yeah,
I don't know why they ring very, very hollow. What is an updated way of teaching them that there's going to be suffering and struggles every day, but those are actually what end up making life the sweetest?
One, I'm a firm believer in repetition, of any habit. And as you're having those conversations, like you mentioned, there are always going to be hurdles. For me, I try to break down what are those hurdles. So if let's say I'm doing play therapy and that question comes up. So what is this hurdle saying to you? What is your life story about it? And it was like, oh, well, I don't want to do that because I remember my friend did that and they got really embarrassed. So a lot of times they make all these different associations with these hurdles. And my goal is to let's break all of those away and then re-tackle this, this same hurdle from your perspective now. In many ways, we've kind of broken the generational, curses or, consumptions about why we feel this thing is hard. And now we are really, giving it a shot. And it's so hard for their generation too, because I feel like the creativity, doesn't go as far because they have failure, and once you fail, that feeling doesn't feel good. So it stops a lot of people from trying to go and try that thing again. And as kids, that's where I encourage them to fail as often as they can, have fun. But as they get older, a pencil is no longer an airplane.
Yeah.
It's a pencil. And, we lose that slight ability to play and be creative and, try new things. So again, I just breaking it down, what does this hurdle say to you? Why is it saying that? And I say that because many years I struggled with, thinking I wasn't a great reader or that I couldn't accomplish things. And I remember in class, I had a friend that had a speech, impediment. And I remember people making fun of him. And I was like, what if I stumbled on a word? Will they, feel the same way about me? So I remember every time it was time to read in class, I figured out how to get out all the way up into college. And I was just like, why am I doing this? And I had to remember that was not my situation to carry,
Yeah.
Like I couldn't control that.
Isn't that funny? I've had similar instances where it's like, it wasn't my failure. It was watching how other people reacted to someone else.
Absolutely.
And I carried that for a long time.
And it stops you from trying.
Yeah, exactly.
It impairs you in many ways. And again, that conversation, how can we minimize the impairment?
Yeah.
It's the thing that we have to focus on.
Yeah, so I think that we almost kind of uncovered something there. Like, watch how you react to watching, whether it be sports or anything. Going back, it's March Madness time right now when we're recording, and I think about that a lot when I'm going through comments on, something as simple as a basketball team's page, and you see how people are talking about another human being.
Yes.
Even if they are, the college kids aren't making this, but if you're criticizing an NBA player who's making millions of dollars, that's still a person.
Absolutely.
And it always shocks me at some of the stuff that people are willing to say.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess, watch what you're saying, because your kids are watching you, and they're not just associating with, oh, my dad thinks LeBron James sucks, as opposed to like, oh, LeBron James tried this, failed, and everyone reacted like this.
And typically it's not a natural critique. You bring in that person's livelihood, and all of these things become a part of that. And, that teaches someone that is okay to do. And it's like, it's not,
Right.
If we all, gave each other a bit of grace, I think it would be an easier world to live in for sure.
And that brings about another question that I've kind of wondered about, like, how long have you been practicing?
So my journey started as a school counselor. I did 5 years as a school counselor, and during that time I was acquired by LPC. So in total been in education 9 years, but practicing about 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe not as big of a sample window, but I wonder if you've noticed a difference in the way that kids' mental health has been affected by, the emergence of technology, because I realize my daughter is coming across stuff at a faster pace
Absolutely.
than I have. And I wonder if that must be the same with everybody because of all the new social media and just connectiveness of everybody across the world, really.
Absolutely. And, as you were speaking about that sample size, I think we're all kind of dealing with it, not only the students, but even adults. When you're online looking at someone else's life, you get that really cool snapshot and you start assessing all the things that you're doing wrong, or, you're comparing your body to that person's body, your upbringing, all of these things you're critiquing, and you're like, what could I have done better? And many times, if we just look at our own data and realize we are improving, that should be enough. And I say that because it makes me think. I had a client that worked for Apple, and we were talking about how cars and Apple, updates every year. And I was like, what would it be like if they made the iPhone 100%? And he said, they'll never make it 100%. I was like, why? And he said, well, they tried to get it 60 to 70% complete. And then they get the rest of their data, from the consumers. Like the consumer tells them what's wrong with these things. And it's like, so if we know these things that we are so in love with are never 100%, why do we hold ourselves to those same values? We're constantly changing our bodies, our hair, our skin, the groups that we're hanging around, all these things. Like we're always chasing perfection versus looking at the data and saying, man, like last year I was 50%, but this year I'm about 75%. In many ways we can use the comparison that they're doing to improve each year, but not in a way where we're trying to be perfect, but as a true measurement of, okay, like this is okay. Like I don't have to strive for perfection. I can just strive for progression in a way.
With all of the things that parents are dealing with these days, because I feel like we're more distracted than we've ever been.
Absolutely.
And I have encountered a lot of parents talking about maybe it's their partner that they just left, but I have heard the label emotionally unavailable thrown around more lately than I've ever heard. And I'm wondering, do you know what they're what they're exactly talking about there, or if that is something you've heard? Or
I've heard it, and I can't say I can give a clear definition, but a lot of times I feel like after, let's say, a long day, that person just feels I can't take anything else. Like I've always heard the phrase, do you mind if I trauma dump on you really fast? And that's that person's way of saying, are you emotionally available to receive what I'm getting ready to share? Can you be present enough to feel, how I feel about this situation? And a lot of times people are like, I'm not available. And that can hurt, because that may be that one opportunity that person was going to share something very important. So in many ways, these things can be dangerous because we're constantly just consuming. It's almost like mindlessly eating, where you're just doing it, you're just going through the flow. So maybe practicing those emotional availability times in your life could really be beneficial, because it's reconnecting with what we're meant to do. We're meant to connect. People want to connect.
Exactly.
That's what we're about. We're not meant to be alone. We're not meant to be, isolated and just being in our own bubble, although that seemed to be what's promoted a lot.
Yeah. How do you, what are some steps people can take to maybe be more emotionally available? Right off the bat, I think that I see so many times, like when my friends come over, a family member enters the house and they talk about being tired, and you see them sit down and the first thing they do is pull their phone out and look at it. I think that maybe some tips on what exactly, can calm us down, and what are some maybe things that are getting us, we think that they're helping, but maybe they aren't.
Not. Yeah, absolutely. One of the most important lessons I learned in grad school was actively listening. We were sitting in a circle, and your job was to tell that person something and have them repeat, what you said. And naturally, you want to caretake. You want to take care of that person. So I'll tell you something and you repeat it, and the teacher says, "Did you say that?" And you can see the person like, "Yeah," but they really did not. So one of the things that you can really practice is if that person is coming over, okay, I'm going to turn my phone off. I'm going to flip it upside down. And as they are sharing, you can just make small moments like, "Hey, do you mind if I stop you for a second? So, Derek, what I heard you say was," and you repeat back what that person said. You're not adding anything extra to that. That's you forcing your brain to actively listen, to actively be present with this person, because now it's forcing you to take in this information, and you don't want to be, considered a bad friend. And if that person did not mean or say those things, they can say, "No, I actually did not mean that." Then you can follow up with, "Well, help me understand more. When you said, the dogs really make you sad." You get me? So it's like and people think we have to do these complex things. No, you simplify it. So if someone repeated that back to you, let's say you were on the phone with the customer service rep and it's like, "Derek, what I heard you say was," and they repeated that back, a lot of times like, "Yeah," because you're acknowledging in that moment, it's like someone heard me, someone is listening to me. But if I'm on my phone and then you're like, "Were you even listening?" Like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah. You said something about you were at the store and you like Pringles." And you're like, "Okay, I'm done." So in many ways, people experience that emotionally unavailability as well. It's like the person didn't even try. So I think just being as present as you can be, and as weird or as hard as that sound, like, "Hey, what I heard you say was," and see what their reaction is. Watch their body language. Is going to acknowledge that you are right there with them.
Mm. Yeah, I saw a lady talking about a TED Talk that she had done. I forgive me, whoever was saying this, because I can't remember her name, but was talking about this idea of using attention. I'll never get it right, but essentially what she said is when you are paying active attention to someone else, the emotions that kind of brings about and the way that it kind of takes those walls down is actually pretty incredible. And that is an obvious indicator of like how happy a relationship is how much attention is being paid back and forth.
Yes. And that's something I, encourage people to practice all the time, not only with friends, but, your partners and, whoever you're around, because it really helps that person feel validated and understood. And it's hard at first when you try and practice something like that because you're going to get it wrong. You're not used to doing it. Typically, the habits that we are participating in every day are going with the flow. When you actively have to work at something, it's going to disturb something a bit. It's going to say, "Hey, we may get this wrong." And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's the part of the data that we should be tracking. Like, I didn't really connect with my friend right here. What could I have done better? Am I open to receive the feedback that they're getting ready to say? Am I listening to understand or to respond to defend my position? You get me?
Yeah. I feel like that's a common occurrence anymore. Now that, kids are growing up with very advanced technology, how can we help them put a barrier between themselves and their technology? Because obviously it ain't going to go away.
Right.
Cell phones and things are here to stay, but how can we teach them how to maybe not be overtaken by it like we were, where we didn't know how much this was going to impact us and our relationships and our happiness, but how are we able to show them and explain to them? Because I think that, with my daughter anyway, she thinks her cell phone is the biggest deal. My dad just got a new cell phone the other day. He doesn't even know what it's called, and that frustrated her so much. Because she's like, "What did you get?" They think it's this special thing, and I feel like I'm the old man shaking my fist at a cloud sometimes because I'm telling her like, there's specific times for it and all this, but I feel like she just thinks I'm doing that just because.
And it's funny that you mentioned that in our last session. That's something that she and I processed. And, it's like, what is one of the things you absolutely love about your phone? She's like, I get to just be on there, be fun, be creative, and watch all these things. And I was like, what is the hardest part about it? She's like, when I have to get off. And I said, why is that hard? She's like, well, because I have nothing to do. And in that moment, I was like, you have a lot to do, And she was like, no, I don't. I don't know what to do with my time. And I think if we just actively practice, self-care, that could start bringing some routine back to just, something outside of technology. I love the boundaries that you have with her. Her app shuts off at a certain time where she's no longer able to engage in things that were, keeping her mind so busy. Not only, her kids, but I think adults can practice that too. Like, can I, shut these apps off at a certain time to where my mind is no longer engaging in that? Maybe 2 to 3 hours before bed, I start winding down and doing a lot of self-care routine. And, I think it's very important what we're feeding our brains before bed, because think about it, you're going to sleep with this thing, you're waking up with it. Like, where's the time for you? Like, where are we finding you in that moment? And I think, just having those boundaries and practicing self-care gives us some type of control, that autonomy back over, our time. And it's, you deserve to have that time too. These things are going to be here. The information is always going to be there. You can always, click your thumb one more time to see the next article. Always.
Yeah.
That's the purpose of it. That's what's so beneficial about these things. You're not going to miss it.
Yeah. And one thing I would caution people with is I've heard a lot of studies coming out, and I see a lot of the language used from the time during the pandemic. Either people talk about time standing still, or it went by really fast. But either way, I've heard a lot of people describe this phenomenon where they really don't remember those years.
Mm-hmm.
And an interesting theory that I heard was, we were all working from home. We were on screens almost all day.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about that, and it's very true. You can get sucked into work or TV or video games when you're online. You don't have those novel experiences to give you like an easily accessible memory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How can we add more novel moments in our day-to-day lives, as parents, because it's maybe not so easy to pack up and go have a vacation.
Yes.
Where that it breaks up that monotony of everyday life. So, because one thing that I say and every parent says is, you blink and they're grown up.
Absolutely.
How do you add more novelty during that time where diapers are preventing you from taking the constant diapers are preventing you from taking a trip?
Absolutely. For me, Derek, I try to find a habit that's very appealing, something that I can do that I'm going to enjoy, that doesn't, allows me to unplug and to kind of reconnect and engage. And for that, sometimes it takes some assessing. It's like, okay, what are my day-to-day activities? Like, truly track where you're spending most of your time. And then if you can, make a list of top 5 things and start scratching those things out. So if I were to take these away, how would I adapt to something else? We're meant to adapt. But until we start assessing where we truly are, then we don't get there. I think life is about micros and macros. It's just like a person who says, and I'm not trying to get into nutrition, but it's like, I've never counted calories. Your body still takes accountability for what it's consuming. Mm-hmm. You get me? Your body counts it. You may not, So it's the same with our lives. It's like, whether you're assessing those things or not, they're still happening. So there's still macros in your life that are taking over, and micro moments that you probably should, invest in and investigate and look at a bit more. So for me, I look at it from that perspective. Like, what are my macronutrients in terms of life? Like, what are these important things that I should be doing? Where are the micros? And I assess and kind of alter that way. And for me, that works, but it may not work for everyone,
Yeah. And I hear a lot of parents talk about, I've used this language before, you look at the things that as a kid that you thought your parents were doing wrong, and you're just not going to do those now as a parent. And I feel like that's how a lot of us, quote unquote, learn how to be a parent, is just by doing some of the things that we like that our parents did and the exact opposite. Yeah. But how do we be proactive and actively seek out, information or ways to be a better parent?
Absolutely. I think just seeking the right help, sometimes that takes a mental health professional, because a lot of us, again, have those blind spots or those biases that we grew up with and we just don't know. So sometimes if we're confronted or we are meeting with someone who's helping us see those things, it can really help. Even with marriages, like a lot of people go in with, this idea that I'm going to treat my partner exactly how I was raised. And for, your parents, that may work, but your partner, like, talk to them, see if those things will work for them. They may not. And if they're not, what are some things that you can come up with together that works for what you're trying to accomplish or build? And I think it's okay to let some of those things go. I know a lot of times we feel like we're losing culture, but in many ways, if those things are not benefiting you where you are, why are we holding on to those things?
Mm.
You get me? It's okay to let those go. It doesn't mean that you're changing who you are.
Yeah. And how do you open a channel of communication with your kid? Like maybe it's my theory is that we're not asking the right questions, but when you talk to your kid about, maybe you see some things like, I texted you the other day about a few things I saw that may have, made me think that my daughter's going through something. But when you go to your kid and you ask them, what's going on, or, how can I help? And they just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. How do you break it down so they maybe understand better what you're asking?
In that moment, I think, we have to put on a different hat. Like, yes, we are parents, but at the same time, they are smart enough to know that something I say could get me in trouble, especially the way I grew up. My parents would say, this is your moment to say whatever you want about me. Deep down, I knew that wasn't my moment to say whatever I wanted about my career. And it takes time to create that. That's not an overnight thing. And even if you're not that person in their life, making sure that they are equipped with that person to share those secrets or those very important things with is important. So you may not be that person, but you're still advocating by putting the right pieces in place for her to feel safe and to have those conversations. And it can be hard, especially if we're just starting these trends and, they're a bit older. So deep down, she's like, something I could say could land me in trouble, So like you have to think she's trying to protect, her stance as well. But I just think advocating and putting the right pieces in place and letting them know like, hey, I may not be the person that you want to share these things with, but what you're going through is very important to me. So I want to make sure the pieces are in place for you to share with someone. Right. And I think just constantly reminding them of that shows the importance of, I'm here with you.
Is there anything that you think that you wish more parents did know or practice?
Oh, I don't want to say anything that'll get me in trouble. As parents, I would like to think that we're all doing our best. And I just say constant assessing where we are as well, where we're operating, in our brains and in our bodies. Because even a few days ago, I got onto my son, but I realized like I was just tired. The next day I was like, I shouldn't have yelled at you, because he repeated the same thing that I did in that moment. I was like, I couldn't do anything but laugh. I was like, Karsten, why did you do that? He said, Karsten, why did you do that? And I was like, that's a clear example of mirroring, what I'm showing him versus, what I should be doing in that moment. So I wouldn't say anything in particular, but I would just say always assessing, think about it like the comparison I made earlier with the phones or the cars. Every year they're upgrading. So as a parent, think about what you want to upgrade and what you're leaving behind. Like if you're a Honda, you don't want your 1996 pieces going into your 2024, Honda. It's like, yes, the name is the same, but what are some things that I can update and change so that I can be right here at this moment? Because a lot of times when we feel like we want to be that 1996 or 97 Honda, we get left behind because times have changed. They are changing. And I've seen it a lot more now. People are willing to let those relationships go and not repair them. So it requires some, internal work, some assessing. What can I do better?
Yeah.
What is my own data saying?
Right. Yeah. And I think what you said earlier, I knew this the whole time, but it always knocks me on my head when I remember it. It's like, they also aren't expecting us to be perfect.
No.
They don't know whether we're doing a good job or not a lot of the times.
Do not.
And so it was just a few years ago, but I started just going back and apologizing.
Yeah.
In those instances where I yelled, at my daughter, for doing something. And I think back to a kid and the way I felt in that moment. It's like, yeah, I did know that I did something wrong, but also it created this very mean internal dialogue that I gave myself.
Yeah.
And so I was like, how do I counteract that? And I just started going back and just admitting, I'm like, hey, I shouldn't have done that. Because, you know, they're going to use that as a barometer for every other relationship that they get in. And if you aren't, even when you're not setting the perfect example, going back and telling them that, hey, that was wrong, that gives them, you know, a frame of reference, you know, for everything moving forward.
Their body keeps the score. They remember it well.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you doing this, man. And I'm, you know, I'm confident that, you know, this is going to help out a lot of parents out there and maybe ease some stress.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Well, thanks, man.
Absolutely.